All right, we're gonna call the meeting to order for EDC. It is 5:07. We'll start out with a roll call. Salvatore Strenzia, Chair.
Rachel White, member.
Connie Berardi, alternate member.
All right, and today we have a presentation from Russell Blair, Director of Education and Communications, Freedom of Information Commission. Gonna teach us how to do it properly, correct?
Try my best.
All right, buddy, you got the floor.
All right. Is this mic on and I'm good on the audio? Okay. It's good to be here tonight. I always appreciate the invitation. My name, as was stated, Russell Blair, Director of Education and Communications for FOI. Do these trainings all across the state. I actually grew up in Connecticut, so it's kind of cool for me to get to come out,
Should we put him on camera?
see all the different cities and towns. With the time we have together tonight, we don't expect you to be an expert in FOI, but we want you to know the basics, enough information so you know what you need to do for your meetings, you know what you need to do if you do end up getting an FOI request, a records request, and also want, the opportunity if you have any questions. So we'll go over some things, but if you have questions, I'll stop a few times and ask, and we'll make sure that we address those. The important thing about FOI in Connecticut to know is it really falls into kind of two buckets. Freedom of Information in Connecticut is about public access to meetings, and it's about public access to records. We want people who live in town to be able to come to our meetings, to hear us talk and debate and discuss the issues, and to hear us make decisions about those issues that impact the people who live in town. And we also want people in town to have access to the records of the town so that they can request information, whether it be about town spending, about, town buildings, town personnel, whatever people want to find out. The Freedom of Information Act gives them the right to request that information. And what makes Connecticut different than a lot of other states, some states have open records laws or freedom of information laws, but in Connecticut, what's different is we have the FOI Commission where I work. So what that means is that if somebody has a problem, where let's say there's an issue with a meeting, the agenda doesn't get posted properly, or the minutes aren't taken, or if they make a records request, somebody's requesting information about the school budget and they're not getting access to it. In Connecticut, it's really easy for somebody to challenge a town if they're not following FOI properly. They can file an FOI complaint with our office. It doesn't cost any money. We get 600 to 700 complaints a year. So, across the state, this is a pretty common occurrence if you think about it. And really the reason we do these trainings is we want to put you in a position where you can avoid those complaints. We don't want you to have to be spending time that you could be spending on board and commission work, having to come to hearings in Hartford and explain, why the minutes weren't filed or why the agenda wasn't posted. So we want to make sure you know what you need to do. And then more importantly, too, I'll give all my contact information at the end. You know that we're always available if you have questions. A lot of times I think people focus on us as kind of the bad guys who come in when something goes wrong, but really my job is to try to come in at the beginning of the process and answer any questions you may have, give you advice on how to do things properly in accordance with the law, and make it so you can avoid, the FOI complaints. Or if a complaint is filed, it's about a substantive, real, thing, it's a significant issue and not something foolish where, the minutes don't get filed or something like that. Sometimes people ask who's covered by FOI. In a setting like this, it's quite simple. If you're on a board or commission of the town, then your meetings are covered by FOI. Records related to your service on the board or commission, emails and, agendas and documents, reports, or, applications, anything you review or that you use as a board member, all that's is covered by FOI. The one thing I'll make a note to say is that subcommittees are also covered by FOI. So I don't know if you have any subcommittees, but just be mindful of that. Sometimes that's something where people get tripped up sometimes is because they think everything at the committee level, but then they don't recognize if you create a subcommittee or, a group that's going to do something on behalf of the board, those groups are covered by Freedom of Information as well. So we'll start with the meetings part because I think that's usually most interesting to people who are on boards and commissions. We'll go through the requirements of meetings, and then, again, a couple times I'll stop along the way to make sure people don't have any questions. If we do, we'll address them. So I think it's important when we talk about meeting under FOI that we actually look what the definition of a public meeting is, because it is pretty specific in the law. Not every assembly of public officials is necessarily a public meeting. Right now, we're doing this in the middle of a public meeting, so this is obviously a public meeting, but I do these presentations and sometimes we do them, in the middle of the day and it's town hall staff, and, sometimes we do them with only a couple members of a board or commission. So A meeting, as defined in the Freedom of Information Act, is any hearing or other proceeding of a public agency, any convening or assembly of a quorum of a multi-member public agency, and any communication by or to a quorum of a multi-member public agency, whether in person or by means of electronic equipment, to discuss or act upon a matter over which the public agency has supervision, control, jurisdiction, or advisory power. So that's a mouthful. I don't expect you to remember all that. But there's three things that I like to think of when I think of a public meeting. So these are the three things I think you want to keep in mind. The first you heard in there a couple times was a quorum. So if you don't know what a quorum is, quorum is a voting majority of your board. So how big is the board you guys have? 8 with the alternates, yeah. So a quorum is, a voting majority of your board. So whenever you have a quorum of your board together, and they are either in person or together electronically, a virtual meeting or email or text message. We'll talk more about that in a second. But when you have a quorum of a board, they're together, in person or electronically, and they're discussing, for lack of a better term, what I call board business. So if you have a quorum, you're together and you're discussing board business, that needs to be happening in a meeting. So a couple things. The first thing I'll talk about is email. This is a really common question that we get. So when you have a quorum of a board on an email chain or a text message thread, any kind of digital communication, you really don't want to be talking about board business in that setting if you have a quorum on the email chain. So if the agenda gets sent out to the members, for example, you don't want people to start replying to the agenda with their thoughts about the items. You don't want to discuss the things, that are before you get to the meeting. If you do that, then the public is not privy to those discussions. They come to the meeting, and the last thing we want to have is people come to a public meeting and the members up here are saying things like, well, we already discussed that. We were emailing about that last week. We met at the coffee shop down the street before the meeting and we talked about it. And we came up with this idea. You don't want that, because you want to be making your decisions and having your debates and having your discussions, at your public meetings. Sometimes people will, say, well, gee, this is kind of a controversial issue, or can we have a pre-meeting, or we want to talk about it so we can all get on the same page before the public meeting. And really, quite frankly, none of that is permissible. If you're talking about board business and it involves a quorum, then it needs to be done at a meeting. And I'll say again, quorum is really an important point. So what that means is, this doesn't prohibit, one member from discussing something with another member. 2 members, it's not a quorum of a board. If they want to talk about what they think about the agenda, or they want to talk privately about an issue, or if one member wants to talk with someone in the town staff about something going on, it's not meant to prevent you from doing that type of discussion or having those types of meetings. But essentially what it is we don't want a voting majority of the board to be meeting and starting to talk about these things, because even with the best of intentions, inevitably you could start leaning one way or the other. And then when you get to the public meeting, there's not going to be that kind of robust discussion. But again, this can be email, text message, Facebook, so anything where you have a quorum of your board is really the thing you want to keep in mind. If you don't have a quorum, you can have discussions. People can give their thoughts, give their opinions, anything like that, because those members don't have a majority of the board. So whatever they come up with, if 2 members of your board think they have a really great idea, they still have to bring it to a meeting for it to be discussed and considered by the rest of the board. Anyone have any questions on that? Okay. Yeah, that would, if it's just a one-on-one conversation, that doesn't make it a meeting. So, if sometimes people, when they send out emails to the whole board, they'll say things like, please don't reply all, or contact me individually if you have questions. Sure. The one thing I'll say with that is, it doesn't sound like this is what you're talking about, but what you can't do is you can't have a situation where you reach out to every person one by one to get their view on something. Some people try that. They say, well, it's, if I just call each person individually and ask them how they're going to vote on it, that you can't do. But if you send the agenda out, one member has a question, they want to contact you directly to talk about something before the meeting, that's fine. The other thing too, you can use email to share documents, to share, maybe, let's say, for example, you get a letter from a constituent in town about an issue. You want to share it with your fellow board members. Not a problem with that. Or you have a proposal that you're going to present at the meeting. You want all the members to have a copy so they can follow along. Nothing in here to prohibit you from sharing documents or sharing information. It's really just when it comes time to discuss these things, you want to have your discussions at your meetings. So a couple ground rules for public meetings. Anyone can attend a public meeting. You can't require people to sign in or anything like that or give their name. It's interesting because a lot of times people will ask me about public comment. So public comment is entirely within the purview of the board, whether or not you have it at your meetings. If you want to make people give their name and address for public comment, or you want to limit public comment, whatever you want to do with public comment is up to you. So public comment, we can put some limitations on, but everyone has the right to attend a meeting. So really FOI, it's about access. It's about allowing people to come to the meeting. They can sit down, they can listen, they can observe. People can record public meetings, so if you're ever at a public meeting, just assume it's being recorded because somebody in the audience could be recording it, that they're allowed to do that under the law, or take pictures or anything like that. So when we think about public meetings, I really like to think about three things. And on the handout that you've got there, you'll see the different it's called the notice of meetings for public agencies, and goes through some of the different requirements. But that's handy. I would suggest keep a copy of that. You can refer back to it. But essentially, there's three things we need to do if we want to have a public meeting. We need to have a notice of the meeting. People need to know, when and where the meeting is going to take place. We have to have an agenda. People need to know what's going to be discussed at the meeting. And we also need to take minutes. So if someone can't make it to the meeting, that they can look back at the minutes and they can see any votes that were taken at the meeting. So those are the three things we want to be thinking about: our notices, our agendas, and our minutes. So the way that I like to look at this is on based on the different types of meetings, because the requirements are similar, but there's a little bit of nuance depending on if it's a regular meeting or a special meeting, and I'll also touch on emergency meetings as well. So regular meetings, at the beginning of the year, every board or commission in the town should file a regular meeting schedule with the town clerk, when you're going to meet for the year. We're going to meet the, first Wednesday of every month or first Thursday of every month, wherever it is. And whatever time, that's your regular meeting schedule, and you file that. So a special meeting is just any meeting that's not on that regular meeting schedule. It could be that you have to change the time of a meeting. If you're going to move a meeting, from 7 o'clock up to 5 o'clock on the same night, that would make it a special meeting. It could be that you're moving, the day of the meeting. There's a snowstorm coming and your normal, Monday night meeting doesn't work. You want to move it to a Wednesday. Could be that you have to add meetings if you only meet once a month and things come up between meetings and you need to address it. You could schedule a special meeting. So the name special meeting is a little misleading, and I find that, sometimes people in town see special meeting and they go, oh my God, something big is happening. Or if I even had board members ask me, can we do all the same things at a special meeting that we can do at a regular meeting? And the answer is, yes, special meeting just means the scheduling of it. What the business of a special meeting, doesn't make it special. It's the scheduling of it. The one change, however, to be aware of is you can't add items to the agenda at a special meeting. So if you ever have a special meeting and you have new business on your agenda, you might as well take it off, because you cannot add any new business at a special meeting. So if you're doing special meeting, just make sure anything on the agenda, anything you may want to take up is on there. You can always pass over items on the agenda. If you don't get to everything at the meeting, that's okay. But if it's a special meeting situation, you can't be adding things at the meeting. So you want to try to avoid that. At a regular meeting, by a 2/3 vote, you can add items to the agenda. A couple situations where that comes up sometimes, because sometimes people ask me, well, why would that be something you need to do? You guys are meeting on Monday. Let's say something blows up over the weekend or Monday morning, wasn't on your radar, but you guys decide we need to do something about it. You could add it to the agenda at a regular meeting. The other thing, if a board has public comment, sometimes people in public comment may bring something to your attention. Again, wasn't on your radar, it's not on the agenda, but the board feels like, well, 15 people came out to speak about something. We want to do something. We want to vote. We want to discuss. If it's not on the agenda, even if it came up in public comment, really you should add it to the agenda as an item. If the board is going to do more than just, thank the people for speaking, if you're going to start to get into a debate or deliberate about the issues that people bring forward in public comment, if it's not something on the agenda, I would suggest adding it. Obviously, if it's on the agenda already, then, you're free to discuss and free to, add what the people say in public comment to the discussion. Anyone have any questions on any of that? So if we're going to have a special meeting, we need to file a notice of a special meeting. So in this case, you got to file the notice in the agenda 24 hours in advance, and that needs to be posted on the website if you have a special meeting. So again, special meeting, make sure you file notice and agenda 24 hours in advance. The agenda for your regular meetings also 24 hours in advance. So agendas always need to be filed 24 hours in advance. And one important thing to know about FOI, this is a law that was created in 1975, and it's been updated from time to time, but there are a lot of places where the law has not kept up with technology. So one of the things that I get a lot of questions about sometimes are the filing requirements. And really, with everything FOI, the town clerk is kind of the clearinghouse for a lot of this information. At the municipal level, the posting requirements in terms of what has to go on online varies. But you always have to file it with the town clerk. So that should always be the first thing you want to do, is make sure, get everything into the town clerk. Again, agendas need to be 24 hours, need to be available 24 hours before the meeting. So what that means is, in some towns, I don't know if that's the case here, sometimes in smaller towns, we have days town hall is closed. I don't know if that's something that, that you have.
No, we're actually open Monday through Friday.
Okay.
But there are times, because we have such a small staff, that people come in and say, oh, I want to get on the agenda. And there is no agenda because no business has happened for that board. And they have to wait until the next time, or we have to schedule a special meeting because there might only be one person who actually can create that agenda.
Sure.
And we have a small staff, so that might not happen in a larger town. But people are kind of patient because they also realize that they also can come in, and because they get such personalized service, that's the flip side to it.
Sure. So that's good that you're open 5 days a week. So you avoid, the challenge in some other towns, if town hall is closed on Friday and you're meeting on Monday, if your town hall's not open Friday, you got to get the agenda in on Thursday. So the one thing you want to be mindful of, though, still are Monday, holidays and things like that. So, if you're, your meeting is on Tuesday and town hall's closed on Monday, then you need to make sure you get the agenda in on Friday. So it's always, needs to be in, date stamped, filed, a day that the town hall is open. So again, if it's a Tuesday meeting situation, you can't bring the agenda in Tuesday morning for a Tuesday night meeting. It's got to be the 24 hours in advance. And then the last thing, we talked about notices, agendas, so minutes. Minutes are pretty simple. The minutes need to be filed within seven days of the meeting. It's, again, I don't know why they made this distinction, but it's 7 calendar days for a regular meeting. It's 7 business days for a special meeting. So special meetings, you have a little bit more time to get your minutes in. And what I'll say with minutes is, FOI doesn't really police the content of minutes. You have to put the votes in the minutes. So, minutes need to have a recording of the votes, and you should make sure you identify how each person voted. So, who are the yeas, who are the nays. You have to list who was in attendance at the meeting. And if you have an executive session, you need to list who attended the executive session. But that's it in terms of FOI requirements for minutes. What I find sometimes is people are very well-meaning, but they try to have perfect, detailed minutes, and they spend so much time trying to get the minutes to be perfect and so detailed and have everything in them that they don't get filed on time. So the number one thing with minutes, you want to make sure you get them in on time within 7 days. They go into the clerk's office. My advice is, if you're going to make changes to the minutes, make those at the next meeting, reflect that in the next set of minutes. Try to avoid a situation where, you're posting multiple versions or taking them down or changing them, unless it's something really significant, major error or something like that. But typically, if it's, small typographical things, the types of things that we typically amend in the minutes, you could make that change at the next meeting. But again, with minutes, my best advice is just get them in on time. You want to have some level of detail. You're probably going to have more than just the votes, but you can sum up. You don't have to include people who spoke in public comment, or if you do include them, you don't have to include every single point, in detail that they made. If people give you documents, correspondence, you don't have to attach that to the minutes. It's up to you if you wanted to, but you're not required. Nobody has a right to appear in the minutes. The board has a lot of control over the content of the minutes. So the most important thing, again, get them in on time. And at the municipal level, I talked earlier about, technology and the law. The 7-day requirement is for them to be filed in the clerk's office. It's not to be posted online. Again, my advice is try to get them posted online as quickly as you can. But the most important thing is you've got to get them into the clerk's office first. So get them in to the clerk's office, and then you can worry about getting them posted online. Anyone have any questions on minutes or anything else? Yeah. Sure. So, the minutes, all the law says is they need to be publicly available. So in a Board of Education situation, they could be at the board office. That would be fine. The agendas should go to the town clerk's office though. So you want to make sure the minutes, you have a little bit more discretion about where you want to file them, but the agendas need to go clerk's office, and they can go in the board office too if you have one. But minutes, if the minutes are at the Board of Education office, that would be fine. Yes. At the municipal level, there's no deadline in the statute. For state agencies, so like our minutes at the FOI Commission, we have to post them online within 7 days. But when this first came up years ago, they gave the towns a little bit more leeway, and it hasn't been changed since. So I think, again, I wouldn't view that as a license to, just sit on them for a month or something like that. Because I think more often today, people will look online first before they ever think of calling the town hall or going to the town hall. And sometimes I find situations where people will call me and they'll say, I was looking for the, North Stonington Board of Education minutes. They're not on the website. It's been 2 weeks. Should I file a complaint? And I have to tell them, hold on, did you actually call them? And, because they may have them and they, they just didn't get posted online. So at the municipal level, as if they're filed and available, then that would be okay. Any other questions? So as I said, we have regular meetings, we have special meetings, and then the third type of meeting is what we call an emergency meeting, as the name suggests, really only in the event of an emergency. And that's because at an emergency meeting, this is an unnoticed meeting. There's no notice, there's no agenda. It's when something happens that is such a emergency that you can't wait 24 hours to schedule, a special meeting. You may see, examples of things like this could be, weather emergency, a public health emergency. And we actually had a real situation, a different one. It's unfortunate, but it's a good example. Up in northeastern Connecticut, in the town of Woodstock, a couple weeks ago, their first selectman died unexpectedly in the middle of the night. The next morning, the two remaining selectmen had to have an emergency meeting because they just had to figure out, how to move forward, who was going to be in charge, who was going to sign the checks, what did they have to do? Did they have to contact the state? What was there going to be an election? Was there going to be someone appointed? All these questions that they had to sort out. So, they had to have an emergency meeting, hours after that happened to deal with it. So there could be situations where you need to have an emergency meeting. That's okay. If you do have an emergency meeting, then the minutes need to be filed within 72 hours of the meeting. So emergency meeting, you have a stricter requirement, and emergency meeting minutes do need to be posted on the website. So if you have an emergency meeting, you file them quicker, and you post them on the website. It's important also to note, as we're talking about all this, we talked about how people can file complaints. Sometimes people often ask about, what are the penalties? What happens if we do something wrong? If we don't file the minutes on time, or we don't prepare an agenda and it's not posted, what can the commission do? So, typically we try not to be too punitive, especially if it's a situation where, it appears like there's a misunderstanding of the law. And in my experience, it's quite often that's usually the case. It's either people are ignorant, or they don't know, or they don't understand it, or they misheard something. So a lot of times, if you ever look through, and these are cases where they actually go to a hearing. A lot of times, for example, if someone files a complaint, your minutes are late, they're not in the office, they file a complaint, we have a mediation process where we try to resolve those. So in this case, someone from our office would call the board and say, hey, what's going on with the minutes? And then they say, well, the recording secretary was sick and this and that. And then we say, hey, file the minutes. They get the minutes filed, and then typically we can get the person to withdraw their complaint. So, hearings are really reserved for, the complaints where, there's some substance to it. We can't resolve it. But even if we go through the hearing process, a lot of times the order is just going to be that, the town understands that what they did was wrong. It is a violation, and essentially don't do it again. Sometimes if we think there's a real lack of knowledge, we'll order a training session like this. So sometimes I have to do this, in response to a complaint that somebody has filed. In really, really rare cases, we can issue fines. So we can issue fines of up to $5,000 against an individual if there's a really egregious violation. But, again, we don't issue fines too often. We try to work through education. But one thing I'll mention with meetings, because this is something you definitely want to avoid, is potentially if there's an issue with a meeting, the commission can nullify any actions that were taken at that meeting. So you can imagine, the consternation if, let's say you're on a planning and zoning commission and you have a really controversial site plan and go through all this public comment and testimony and there's a big debate and you vote on it and it turns out, the agenda wasn't posted properly or something like that. The commission could come in potentially and we could say, wasn't proper notice of the public meeting. You have to go back and do it again. So, that's just another reason. Obviously, this is the law. We want to follow the law, but it's another reason that we want to avoid, having complaints filed against us. So the next thing I want to touch on are the rules about electronic and remote meetings. Not going to go into every single detail on this. If you're interested, there's a link on our website to what we call our remote meetings primer, and that goes through all the different requirements if you want to have remote meetings. And I think that's the most important thing to know is it's an option. It's not required. During COVID, a lot of towns invested in equipment, to do remote meetings, to have hybrid or Zoom. So in some cases, people want to continue that, which is great. If they want to do that, if people like it, that's fine. But also there's nothing that says that you can't, return to doing your meetings in person. The important thing to know, though, is that if you are going to have what we call electronic meetings, there's some additional requirements that go with that. So I'm going to touch on the two things that I see most frequently that I get the most questions about as it comes to electronic meetings. The first one is people often ask about recording meetings. Do we have to record meetings? If we do, what meetings do we record? What do we do with the recordings? So the only meetings that you have to record in accordance with FOI are meetings where everyone is participating remotely. So if you have a total Zoom meeting, the public is on Zoom, the commissioners are on Zoom, presenters are on, everyone's on Zoom. If you have a meeting like that, then you need to record that meeting. And if you record that meeting, you have to post it on your website within 7 days, and it has to remain on your website for at least 45 days. So totally virtual meeting, we record it, we post it online within 7 days, and we leave it up for at least 45 days. If it is an in-person meeting or it's a hybrid meeting, you don't have to record it under FOI. You still may want to record it, to have a record for the town. I find that more and more, kind of like when we talked about the website minutes, I find more and more people expect to find videos of the meetings, so I think it's a service if you can do it for people in the town. Again, not required if it's not a fully online meeting, so that, you have a little bit of discretion about. And then the other thing I wanted to mention too with electronic meetings is there's one change in the notice of the meetings. So, earlier on I said everything about, 24 hours. However, if you want to have an electronic meeting, there's a requirement that 48 hours before the meeting, the instructions to attend the meeting need to be made available to the public. So typically what that means is, if it's a Zoom meeting, the Zoom link or, a dial-in number or the Teams invite, whatever it is, however people are expected to log on and view the virtual meeting, you need to make sure that you have that available 48 hours in advance. That's for any meeting with a virtual component, so hybrid or fully remote. So anytime we're going to open it up, electronically, make sure the link is out there 48 hours ahead of time. The agenda is still 24 hours, so you don't need to post the agenda 48 hours ahead of time. But the link should be somewhere on your website. If you have a meetings calendar, it could go there. If you have a page for your board, you could put it there. I've seen some towns where, with Zoom, you can generate the links ahead of time. So you could even, if you're going to have Zoom meetings for the year, you could generate all the links and post them or, whatever, however you want to do it. But as long as the link is out there 48 hours ahead of time, you're okay with that.
There are, I think, a few commissions that don't do hybrid meetings, but for the most part, we're doing hybrid meetings across most of the town commissions. So, I mean, and the nice part, like you said, is, if you work a different schedule, we're all sitting here, we were available at 5 o'clock to come to the meeting, and maybe because we worked from 8 to 4 today, or because we left early to make sure we were here, but not everybody works that type of schedule. And we certainly have a lot of folks in our community who work shift work where, they might be working second shift, but then tomorrow they can watch the recording. So they can still at least, be aware of what's happening. And I think that's one of the advantages that we've had with the technology, how it's come forward. Maybe that's one of the good outcomes of COVID is that, transparency wise, now more people can be aware of the information that's out there. So my opinion.
No, that's certainly a great point. And I've also heard that, you know, in some situations, it can also be it can help with recruitment of board members. You know, if you could tell people, hey, you know, if something comes up and you have a sick kid at home or something like that, you know, you can join the meeting remotely. You know, you're not going to have to always necessarily come in person to town hall to come to the meetings.
But it's a policy here that you can't vote if you're on, oh no, but a commission can, and, or, that's just for the town meetings. All right, I had a quick question back to the emergency and the special meetings.
Sure.
You can only vote on agenda items, or can you vote at all on those meetings?
So you can vote on anything that's on the agenda. You just can't add anything to the agenda.
So you can vote on agenda items. That's what
Yeah.
I thought, I just wanted to,
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. So again, special meeting, it's just you're not going to modify the agenda.
you
So
can't modify.
yeah,
it,
whatever's
leave it
on the
like that.
agenda that you have that you put out there is your agenda.
All right, and all our Zoom meetings are recorded? Is that what you just said?
Yes, all our Zoom meetings are recorded and they're all, you know, linked live to YouTube and saved onto the website. So that if people want to watch them later or ask a question,
Yeah.
they
didn't
can
know we were
call into the
100%.
office.
Okay,
So,
cool.
yeah.
As long as you're more than 24 hours out, then yeah, you could. Yeah. So there's, I guess there's a window where you could amend it, but once you're inside the 24 hours, you couldn't make any changes and you can't add items at the meeting. Yes. I think you could change the order. I think that would be fine. It's really what it comes down to is you don't want to add business that has not been properly noticed because you're already scheduling a meeting that was not on the meeting schedule. So the idea is, you know, you're already deviating in one way. We don't want to deviate again by, you know, you can imagine the situation where a board calls a special meeting and then starts adding things that weren't on the agenda. And, you know, it gets away from being transparent. So that's kind of the idea behind that. Any other questions on electronic meetings or anything else we've covered so far? Okay. So the next part about meetings that I want to talk about is what I think is the trickiest part for meetings, maybe not for your board, but maybe for some other ones, and that's executive session. You know, I said earlier about the complaints that we get. We get far more complaints about records issues than we do meetings, but when we get meetings complaints, executive session tends to be, you know, a thing where we see complaints about, and it makes sense if you think about it, because an executive session is part of a meeting that you're closing off to the public. So people typically want to know what the board is talking about. And if they think that, you know, the board is talking about something they're not supposed to be talking about in executive session, somebody may file a complaint. So the important thing, you know, to be thinking about with executive session is it's really quite limited. If you ever look at the FOI Act and you look at the section about executive session, you'll see that it's, you know, specifies the reasons that you can go into an executive session. You know, executive session is not, you know, those things we talked about earlier. You know, if you want to have a conversation, you know, before a controversial meeting, that's not a reason for executive session. It's not, you know, I've heard this from boards and commissions and it drives me crazy, you know, where, well, we're afraid of public blowback. We want to talk about something. That's not a reason to talk about it, you know, executive session. Really, you know, we'll go through the reasons in a second, but if we think about the reasons for an executive session, in a lot of cases, you know, there's a public reason that we're doing this. You know, one of the reasons to have an executive session is to discuss strategy related to a pending claim or litigation. So you can imagine it's in the town's best interest if someone is suing the town, they had to sit up here and talk about their legal strategy. The person who's suing them could sit in the audience and could hear, you know, everything that the town is doing to try to defend itself against a lawsuit. So really, you know, if you think about this, it's situations where a lot of times there's a public reasoning behind it. So we can have an executive session to discuss pending claims or litigation. You know, that could be a lawsuit, it could be a CHRO complaint, an FOI complaint. It could also be the board considering taking some legal action. You know, sometimes, you know, a board may sue a state agency or take some kind of enforcement action or something like that. That could be a topic for executive session. You can have an executive session to discuss personnel matters. And this is personnel matters, meaning, you know, dealing with a particular employee or town employee, you know, town employees. You know, it's not personnel matters, you know, talking about the budget, you know, staffing at the police department is not, you know, a personnel matter under FOI. The important thing with personnel matters is that if you have an executive session for personnel, you need to notify the person who's being discussed. So, if the Board of Education is going to go into executive session to, discuss the conduct of a teacher, they have to notify that teacher. And then that teacher has a right to request that that discussion be held in an open session. So, if you work for the town or you're an employee of another town and you're ever notified that they're going to discuss you in executive session, your right is not necessarily to go into the executive session with the board. A lot of times they'll invite you in. Obviously, if you're discussing a disciplinary matter, you want to talk to the person who's involved. But your right under FOI is to have an open session. So sometimes we see that where people think they're being wrongfully accused of something, or they want to, have their colleagues or family or people attend the meeting to hear what's going on. So if somebody requests an open session, the board has to grant that. You can have an executive session to discuss security matters if you feel that a public discussion would undermine the issue that you're talking about. We saw this unfortunately a lot after Sandy Hook. Schools were reevaluating their security systems. There was state funding that went out to improve, security systems and install, bulletproof glass and cameras and panic buttons and all that. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense that we don't want to have the details of our security protection being discussed publicly. The important thing with all this, again, is it's only discussion. So you're not voting on anything in executive session. So, if the town is considering buying a new security system for, the school across the street, they could talk about the parameters of it in an executive session. But when it comes time to spend the money, they would need to have a public vote. So whatever action you're going to take, if you're going to settle a lawsuit, if you're going to fire an employee, if you're going to accept someone's resignation or buy a security system, the votes are always going to be taken in public. You don't have to discuss the matter in public. So, you don't have to talk about the details of the security system, but you would have to say something like, we're going to vote to appropriate $50,000 to buy a new security system for the elementary school. You can also discuss the sale or lease of property if you feel like a public discussion would impact the price point. If the town is considering buying a piece of land, maybe you want to build some new athletic fields or something like that. You may not want to have a public discussion because the property owner could sit in the audience and could hear, the board talking about how much they can afford to offer and what they're going to go up to if the first offer is rejected. Those types of things related to a land acquisition or a lease can be discussed. And then the last reason for an executive session is the broadest, and that's that you can discuss any records that are exempt from FOI. So this could include things like draft documents. There's an exemption for draft documents. You could review and discuss those in an executive session. Anything protected by attorney-client privilege. So if you, had a matter where you were getting advice from your town attorney, they wrote up a legal memo and distributed that to the board, that could be discussed in an executive session. And there's also a limited exemption as it relates to bids. So if you go out to bid for a project, before you award a contract, you can have an executive session where you could discuss the bids, review the bids. Once you award the contract, however, everything becomes public. All the documents would need to be disclosed. You need to have a 2/3 vote to go into executive session. You should be careful with agendas for executive session because we want to have a little bit more detail than just one of those reasons. So you don't want to just have, executive session personnel, executive session security. If it's a personnel matter, maybe it's something like executive session, discussion of personnel matters in the public works department, or executive session discussion of security plans for the elementary school, things like that, where the person is still who wants to look at the agenda is still going to know the topic that's being discussed, but they don't get to know all the details of it. The executive session discussion is off limits, but the topic of what's being discussed needs to be publicly disclosed. The last thing with executive sessions that I'll mention is that people ask sometimes who can go into an executive session. So it's up to the board. You can invite in whoever you need for the executive session, but really the way that it works is you should only keep the people for as long as you need them, for you to be asking them questions or for them to be giving their opinion, their expertise, their testimony about what happened. When it comes time for the board to discuss something among the board themselves, then everyone should be asked to leave the room, including people who may have been in the executive session for part of it. Anyone have any questions on executive session?
Let me just clarify something. When you say get people to leave the room, I've worked in different towns where in one case they had the audience leave the room, and in the other case where they had the board members retire to a separate room. And then when we started recording meetings, that gets a little more convoluted actually, because when you're broadcasting and you have people watching, then do you put up a placard, which is what I've seen done before? Hey, we've gone to executive session. And then if you log in, that's what you see, so that you know that they're still broadcasting, but they're just in the part of the meeting that isn't, open to the public. Is there any sort of formality, one way or the other, of how it should be done?
No, that's a good question, especially the digital part, because I'll touch on that in a second. But um, how you want to do it is really up to you. I've seen it done both ways too. A lot of times it kind of depends on, the layout of the building, quite
Yeah.
frankly, because sometimes, the council chambers, they have a room behind them. They can just go through the door and they can go in the back. That would be fine. The one thing you want to be careful of, especially with electronic meetings, is, if people are being asked to leave the room for the executive session, you need to make sure that you let them know when the executive session is over, and that you resume the meeting, that you have a vote, you come back out. Any votes that you take are in public, that you vote to adjourn. What you don't want to do is you don't want to adjourn from executive session. And I know in the digital sphere, this can get a little complicated, but we actually had a case, and it was found to be a violation. There was a situation where the last item on an agenda was an executive session. And this was earlier on in COVID, when people didn't quite know how to do it. And what do we do? Do we put them in a breakout room? Do we not do, and there was only one member of the public who was on the meeting, and they told the guy, we're going to go into executive session. We're shutting down the meeting, and we'll call you if we vote on anything. You can't do that, so you have to find a way where people can be kicked out. Either the board leaves, or the public goes into a holding pen, whatever it is. But once the meeting resumes, bring everyone back in, even if the only thing you're doing is just adjourning. You need to make sure that you end the meeting in public. You can't end the meeting from executive session. Yes. So I would say with pending, it has to be filed, or it needs to be imminent, in that, like, you've received a demand letter or something like that. If someone sends the town a letter and says, we're going to sue you unless you do this, you're on the Board of Education, and they say, unless you pay for my kid to go to private school for 4 years, I'm going to sue the town. Like, that would be something you could act on. But it shouldn't really be speculative. It shouldn't be, well, this is kind of thorny and we're not sure. My advice would be, if you want to go in to sort of discuss the legal implications of something, the best way to do it is have your town attorney write up something, and then you can go in under an exempt document and you discuss the legal advice from the town attorney. So that would be something that would be permissible, but not just a free-ranging discussion about the potential liability of doing something. Yeah, you don't have to vote to come out of executive session. Sometimes people ask about, like, do we need the vote? And what I tell people is, I think generally you'll know when you've reached the point when you can leave the no, because you're not voting to come out of executive session. Sometimes people come out of executive session and they'll say no votes were taken, just to make it clear that they didn't vote on anything. But no, that's correct. You still vote to adjourn, but you don't have to vote to end the executive session. When you do the minutes, make sure you note the time that you went in, the time you came out, and you list who attended the executive session. So that is something, in the virtual world and other, when you were saying about whether they leave or come back, however you do it, but in the minutes, you do have to include the attendees of the executive session. So any other questions on executive session? Okay. So the last thing I want to touch on with meetings is, we talked about all the requirements, and then there are exemptions to the meeting requirement. The number one is caucuses. So, everything I said before about a quorum and all this and the communication, if the members of the board are of the same political party, they are allowed to caucus, even if it's a majority of a board. So if you have a situation where, the Democrats control the Board of Education, then even if they're a quorum, they can caucus. And the challenge is that FOI doesn't define what a caucus is, so there's really no limits under our law about what they can talk about. Again, we hope that people don't use caucus as a way to get around a public discussion. But if someone were to file a complaint, I got these emails, and the 4 Democrats on the Board of Education were all talking about, school issues. If they said it was a caucus, then that would be a defense against that. So caucuses are permissible, same board, same party. Couple other instances where this comes up, you can create a personnel search committee to hire an executive level employee. We see this a lot at boards of education. You want to hire a new superintendent, you create a search committee. The search committee can operate outside of FOIA. You can also have strategy sessions related to collective bargaining outside of public meetings. So, if the Board of Selectmen wanted to sit down with the union president and go over the new contract for town hall employees, they could do that outside of a meeting. Obviously, they can't vote on anything until they do it, gets to a meeting, but they could have a discussion. And then the other thing to keep in mind too is what we call chance or social meetings. So what that means is, when you have a quorum of a board gathered together, but they're not there for the purposes of discussing board business, that doesn't make it a meeting. That's one of the three things we talked about. But this essentially means, you can go out to dinner with your board members, you can go to the bar with your board members, you can go to the baseball game with your board members, but don't be talking about, board business when you're in those settings. You want to try to avoid what I call the parking lot meeting, which is you have your meeting, and after the meeting, everyone's standing around in the parking lot, and you're talking, and you're venting, and you're blowing off steam, and that sort of thing. And it's okay to have those conversations, but you want to avoid really getting back into the substantive discussions that you had when you were here at the table, or talking about things that are going to come up at the next meeting. You don't want somebody who has business before the board to be leaving and they hear you talking about, what went on, and maybe they file a complaint with us because they feel that, that was improper for you to be discussing their application or their matter outside of the board meeting. Anyone have any questions on that? So they wouldn't have to take any minutes, but with all those, caucuses and negotiations, any documents that get created would be available under FOI. So even if you have people ask me sometimes, can we have an email caucus? You could, but the emails are public records. So potentially, depending on, what was discussed there, it could be that the documents are public even if the meeting itself is not. So you don't have to notify those caucuses. You do, like, if you're nominating candidates and stuff, those you have to go in the newspaper and all that. But for a caucus of a board, you wouldn't have to notify. Any other questions? So the last thing I just want to touch on, because I know you guys are running off to the town meeting. The one important thing I want to make note of with the records part of FOI as it pertains to board members is that the device you use does not matter in terms of whether or not something is a public record. Something is a public record because it reflects the public's business. So if you're on a board or commission and you use your personal cell phone, your personal email accounts, all that, there's nothing wrong with that. And in most towns, especially small towns, people have to. The town is not going to buy you an email to serve on, Economic Development Commission or buy you a phone to do that. But what that means, though, is that if somebody requests records and you have them on your personal device, or you have emails discussing board business on your Gmail account, you may have to search through those emails or text messages, or search through your computer at home for documents if you get an FOI request. So it's okay to use a personal device, but just remember, if you use your personal device or email or cell phone for board business, then the records you create relating to the board are public records. So my advice would be, if you have the opportunity to use a town email, you may want to think about that, because then all your stuff is in one place in terms of your board business. The other thing that's an advantage too is if you use a town email and you get a request, potentially you might have IT people who can help you. If it's on your personal Gmail account or your cell phone, they may not be able to help you to the same extent. And then the last thing too with records that I'll mention too, board members, you probably don't get a lot of FOI requests, but if you do ever get an FOI request, one important thing to keep in mind is that you have to acknowledge the records request within 4 business days. So if you get an FOI request, and again, people should only be directing FOI requests to you concerning records that you have. So if it's not something you have, if it's something that is a Board of Selectmen issue or it's a zoning issue, you could tell the people you got to go to that department. But if it is something that you have or that your committee has, you need to acknowledge the records request within 4 business days, and then the records need to be provided promptly. So there's not a specific time frame. So, it's kind of meant to be this reasonableness standard that you have in terms of responding to an FOI request. Every request is going to be a little bit different in terms of how long it takes, but we look at factors including size and scope of the request, other business of the board, what else do you have going on? Is it a busy time of year for you? Is it summer and everyone's on vacation? There's all these different factors that we look at, but my advice would be, if you get a simple request, just take care of it quickly. If it's complicated, You can always escalate it. You know, you can talk to folks at town hall. You can contact your town attorney if, you know, it's something really complicated that needs to get involved with redactions or anything like that. Or you can always call our office too. So let me do that before I forget. So the number, you know, if you don't have it, it's also on our website, 860-566-5682. And then my email is just my name. So Russell, RUSSELL .Blair, BLAIR @ct.gov. Please don't hesitate to call or reach out if you have any questions. As I said, really my whole job is to try to do the education, answer the questions, give you the guidance on the front end so you know what you need to do, you do it correctly, you do it effectively, and you don't find yourself, you know, on the other end of an FOI complaint, because it's not fun. You know, you have to deal with a hearing and come to Hartford and get an attorney involved and all that. So we really want the boards to be able to do their work. You guys are busy as it is. You don't have time to be coming to, you know, it'd be nice to see you at the office, but, you know, we don't want you up there for an FOI complaint. But does anyone have any other questions, either about meetings or records or anything we didn't touch on? Yes. Sure. So if it's being shared and people are not discussing it, then that would be okay. You know, if you're just sharing information, I just wanted to provide you with an update on the project. Here it is. You know, please to your point, contact me offline, you know, email me if you have questions. As long as you're not inviting a discussion about that document, then that would be fine. So I think there's a couple different ways you could do it. You know, one way would be like, you know, let's say it's a planning and zoning meeting and a commissioner brings up something and the town planner says, I'll get back to you on that. The town planner could email the person individually, okay, here's the answer to your question, and they could go back and forth about it if they wanted to. Or the town planner could send the answer, copy everyone and say, no discussion, but here's the answer I'm giving to, you know, Commissioner Smith, but I want everyone just to see it so, you know, you all understand. So the idea would be you could answer the question, but if people want to get into a back and forth discussion further, or they want to, you know, involve a quorum of the board, then you do it at the next meeting. But if it's individual, it wouldn't be a problem. Yeah, the real thing is discussion. That's when you start getting into a back and forth discussion over something. That's really when it, you know, triggers, in my view, the third requirement for a meeting. If it's just, you know, one person can't discuss something. If you're just sharing a document, sharing an email, sharing a proposal, sharing an update, you know, that kind of thing. You know, nothing wrong with that. You know, if something happens in the school district and the superintendent wants to email the Board of Education to keep them up to date, you know, this is a situation that happened at the school today. Before I send out the letter to the parents, I'm just going to share it with you so you have it. That's okay, but they shouldn't start jumping in and discussing it, you know, together as a quorum of the board. Yes. You know, it's a policy decision how you do that. I think the reason that you know, the problem with having a board member send it out potentially is, again, if people start jumping in and replying. But I don't think there's any prohibition, you know, on it. But again, the thing is, you don't want to invite a discussion. You know, right in the definition of meeting, to discuss or act upon a matter over which they have, you know, jurisdiction, control, supervision, or advisory power. So if you're just sharing something, you know, it's not a discussion. If it's one person sharing, is not a discussion. Once people start to reply back, and that's the problem, is, you know, you could send it out, and then when one person jumps back in, now you're in a discussion all of a sudden. And the whole, yeah, exactly. So some people do that. They say don't reply all, or I've also seen situations where sometimes they'll BCC everyone so people cannot reply all. You know, I've seen that too. So again, you know, the meeting provision is not to prevent you from sharing information, but it's to prevent you from discussing that information until you get to the next meeting. The best thing you could do would be to say, here's the update. Let's talk about this at the next meeting. I want you to be aware this is coming up. We can talk about it at the next meeting if you have questions. If you do that, then you're fine. Yeah, if you said like, okay, yeah, if you just say got it, I mean, that's not really a discussion about the issue. But yeah, you don't want to start getting into people adding in their thoughts. A lot of times where I see this is, somebody will even say, here's the proposal for the meeting. Let's talk about it at the meeting. Please don't reply all. And then somebody didn't read the whole email and they start jumping in and they're saying, this is a terrible idea. How could we do this? Blah, blah, blah. And then you start to pre-discuss the issue before the meeting. That's really what it's about. So we don't want to discuss things before we get to the meeting. We can keep people updated. We can share information. We can share documents. We can share letters. We can share, but we don't discuss until we get to the. I mean, so. Yeah, I mean, sometimes what people will do. So I've seen that happen before. Some people, they realize, an oopsie, and they'll say, well, it turns out we had this, so we're just going to append it to the minutes. Sometimes what happens, at the FOI commission, somebody files a complaint about this. A lot of times that's the remedy is we will say, well, go make minutes of your improper email conversation, just make minutes so it's recorded. But with email, those are public records too. So somebody could FOI it and still find out what the discussion is. We don't want to do it, but with email, it's maybe easier to fix than, you have an in-person huddle before the meeting and, people don't recall what was said or there's no record of it or something like that. Any other questions? Good. All right. Well, thank you so much. No, that's great. No, that's great. I really appreciate it. And again, please don't hesitate to call anyone in town. Questions, I'm always happy to help. Thanks.
All right, and on behalf of the EDC, thanks for coming here. It was very informative, I think. Great. So we're gonna plow through this so that we can get to the budget meeting. Minutes, do we have? Oh, no, we don't have a quorum. So, never mind. So, public comment. Anyone have anything for the EDC? Treasurer's report, we'll skip. Do you have anything quick you'd like to add?
I'll just share with you that, we have been very busy, in town hall as the weather has gotten better. We've had a lot of folks, coming in, at the Planning and Zoning Commission. We've started to discuss, now that we've gotten past, the approval of the POCD, what other issues are coming up in town. So if there are things, that you think, updates that we need to make to the regulations or things, directly related to your charge, in the EDC of how to make North Stonington more business friendly, or we need to be more careful about how we're doing this or doing that. Those are things that you could definitely weigh in on. There are a couple of hot topics that we're already sort of working on because they were sort of handed to me that there were things either missing or that needed to be clarified in the regulations. And some of them are, one of them in particular is something we've actually been doing correctly all along, but it's not actually written in the regulations. So we need to make sure that we sort of quantify that and make sure that we're doing the right things. So
Okay, great.
we're just trying to do a little bit of cleanup in that regard. So, but if there's something that directly relates to the EDC that we need to take care of, I'm obviously new enough that I haven't used these regulations a lot. So please make sure you point that out to me or come into town hall.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Alrighty. We're gonna probably not go over much of the old business at this point. Not enough of us severely here, so unless
That's
it's something
fine.
that you need us.
No, and if you'd like to, I mean, we certainly understand that people would like to, get set up for the town meeting tonight. So if you want to adjourn and we can,
Yeah.
next month get to those things.
Right.
And I'll just remind you, that during your meeting in July, that I'll be out of town that day. So we had discussed perhaps canceling that meeting unless there was something really, really dire that we needed to meet for. And that's
Yeah.
4th of July week, so I'm guessing that a lot of folks might be on vacation anyway.
Actually, I'm away.
Okay, So if it's, so what we're, just
I'll
a
talk to Emily,
reminder,
I'll-
not everyone, I think
it's
was
him.
here last time when we kind of talked about
Yep.
that. So just to bring that up again.
great.
Okay, I know you can't make any decisions, but just so that you, have that on your own calendars.
All right, great.
Okay,
All right, do you guys have anything to add before we,
all right.
a motion? Well, we really can't vote, so.
No, you really can't. We
So
didn't
we
want
never
to,
adjourn.
well, not
We
really,
never
but
really had a-
we did want to make sure that with our speaker who, drove from over an hour away, that he was, recorded and
No.
able to share his
I'm
information.
glad we could
so-
help them.
Yes.
Good.
Okay. Thank you very